They thought no one would notice. They stuffed a 5-month-old golden retriever into a donation bin like he was a forgotten blanket, only, he didn't forget. He held on to that old red cloth like it was the only memory he had left. But what they didn't expect, was who would find him. A grieving man who hadn't smiled in 3 years. A little girl who had stopped hoping. And a dog who refused to let go, until someone finally held on. Would you have driven away? Or would you have stopped like Caleb did? Let us know, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of second chances. Maple Hollow, Vermont, was the kind of town that felt like it had a heartbeat all its own, soft, steady, and just a bit nostalgic. In early October, the leaves had begun their grand performance, scattering the streets with crimson and gold while the wind carried the first sharp edges of approaching winter. That morning, the air had the dry, smoky crispness of burning firewood, and the sky wore the soft gray of an overcast quilt. Caleb Rivers turned into the parking lot of the Maple Hollow Community Donation Center just past 10. He drove a dented Navy pickup truck, a Ford from the 90s, its bed filled with cardboard boxes of old tools, a broken lamp, and clothes his mother insisted she no longer needed. Caleb was 32, tall and broad-shouldered with shaggy brown hair that curled at the ends, and a jawline that seemed locked in a permanent expression of almost said something. His eyes, pale hazel with green flecks, had learned to hide things. Since the accident that took his fiancée 3 years ago, he had walked through life with the careful quiet of someone afraid to break anything else. He pulled the truck up beside the metal donation bin, a large white container with fading red letters that read, "Thank you for giving." He stepped out, stretched his back, and lifted the first box when he noticed something odd. A piece of bright red fabric was hanging out of the bin's narrow chute, dangling like a tongue lolling from a sleeping mouth. The fabric moved, not swaying, but shifting. Caleb squinted, lowered the box onto the pavement, and approached. The air around the bin smelled faintly of old cotton and something else, something warm and alive. Caleb pushed the flap open and peered inside. There, curled into the tightest ball he'd ever seen, was a puppy. He was a golden retriever, about 5 months old by the look of him, with soft, matted golden fur that darkened around his ears. His legs were too long for his frame, paws clumsy and oversized, and his ribs showed just faintly beneath the thin fluff. What caught Caleb wasn't the size or the fur, it was the eyes. Large, round, and dulled by fear, the pup's gaze was steady but vacant, as though he had seen something too sad for his young age. His front paw gripped the corner of the red blanket as if it were a lifeline, not a possession. Caleb's voice, when it came, was softer than he expected. "Hey, buddy. What are you doing in here?" The puppy didn't growl. He didn't bark. He didn't move at all. Caleb looked around, no one in the lot, not even a car idling in the distance. He crouched, slowly reaching in, palms open. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said. The puppy flinched but didn't retreat. Caleb's fingers found the warm ridge of the pup's side, and he lifted gently. The dog was so light it was shocking. Bones and fear, held together by fluff and warmth. As Caleb lifted him out, the dog kept one paw knotted around the blanket. Caleb sighed. "All right. You can bring it." Behind him, a voice broke the silence. "You need help?" Caleb turned. A young woman in a volunteer vest stood just outside the donation center's door. She was perhaps 20, with short black hair tied in a stubby ponytail and bored eyes hidden behind oversized glasses. Her name tag read Lisa. Lisa was slight, with a voice that seemed permanently wedged between disinterest and routine politeness. "I think someone left this guy in the bin," Caleb said. She raised one eyebrow and looked at the puppy, then shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time. We had a guy dump 2 kittens in a shoebox last week. Technically that bin's not for animals, but," she trailed off, offering nothing more. Caleb shifted the dog in his arms, adjusting the blanket so the pup's nose could nuzzle deeper into it. "Is there space inside?" Lisa frowned. "We're kind of full." Intake lists about a week long. She didn't say it, but the implication hung in the chilly air. A week was a long time for a scared, underfed puppy. Caleb nodded once. Okay. Thanks. And with that, he turned back toward his truck. He opened the passenger door and laid the red blanket gently across the seat. The puppy followed the motion of his arms, curling into the fabric before Caleb had fully set him down. By the time the truck door closed, the puppy's eyes were shut, ears twitching with each breath. He was asleep before the engine started. As Caleb pulled out of the lot, he glanced down. The puppy remained motionless, save for the occasional ripple of breath through his side. Caleb didn't drive straight home. Instead, he wandered side streets slowly, letting the engine hum beneath them. Somewhere between the second and third turn, he found himself speaking aloud, not loudly, but enough to be heard. I guess we'll figure this out. There was no response, but Caleb thought he saw the puppy's paw twitch, a gentle flex against the blanket. By the time he turned into his driveway, the sun had started its afternoon descent, slipping behind amber trees and casting long shadows on the pavement. His house was a modest one-story with chipped white paint and a porch swing that hadn't moved since spring. From inside came the clink of dishes and the soft melody of an old radio show. June Rivers, his mother, was in the kitchen. June was 65, thin as a rail with silvery hair tied back in a bun that had survived since sunrise. She was brisk but kind, and had the kind of voice that could shush children and wake grown men. Life had made her cautious, widowed young. She had raised Caleb alone after his father died in a construction accident. Since her husband's passing, she had learned to be practical to a fault. When Caleb entered with the puppy in his arms, June didn't look up at first. Put the donation receipts on the counter, she said, wiping her hands. Caleb didn't answer. She turned and saw him. The dish towel dropped. What on earth is that? Caleb set the puppy down gently on the old armchair by the door. The blanket spread like a quiet claim to territory. Found him in the donation bin, he said. June crossed the room in 3 steps, bent to examine the dog without touching him. He's filthy. Look at the legs, he's scraped up. And that blanket is disgusting. But her voice wavered. She reached one cautious hand out, stopping an inch short of his head. The puppy stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to acknowledge her, then closed again. I'm not keeping him, Caleb said quickly. Just for now. They don't have room. June sighed, turning away but not arguing. She returned to her dish towel. He needs food. Probably hasn't eaten in days. Caleb smiled. I'll run out and get something. As he moved toward the door again, he glanced over his shoulder. The puppy had not moved from the blanket, but his body looked a little less curled, a little less tense. Next door, a curtain shifted. Behind it, a pair of wide eyes watched the scene with silent wonder. Ellie Whitmore, 9 years old and often alone in her room, had seen the entire thing through her bedroom window. Ellie had long, frizzy brown hair and wore a brace on her left leg from a bike accident the year before. Her world was small: books, pencils, and dreams. She had never owned a pet, though she'd begged her mother more than once. That evening, as she pulled her sketchbook toward her and began to draw what she had seen, the man, the golden puppy, and the red blanket, she whispered to herself, "Hi, doggy," and smiled. In her mind, a story was already forming. A night had arrived. Not for her. Not yet. But maybe someday. The air in Maple Hollow the next morning carried the bite of frost. A thin veil of condensation gathered on windows, and brittle leaves skittered across sidewalks like little messengers of the season's change. Inside the Rivers house, the morning light crept slowly through the kitchen window, illuminating the quiet domestic scene: a worn wooden table, a black and white tile floor that needed regrouting, and the scent of weak coffee drifting into every corner. Finley, the golden retriever puppy, lay nestled on the same red blanket from the day before, placed carefully in an old laundry basket lined with a folded towel. His breathing had deepened, his body now fully relaxed for the first time in what was likely days. His golden fur, though still tangled, gleamed faintly in the slanted light. June Rivers stood across the room, arms folded, her expression somewhere between stern and soft. She wore a cream cardigan over her flannel nightgown, her silver hair braided into a neat crown as always. She wasn't a woman given to dramatics, but as she observed the puppy from across the kitchen, something shifted beneath her usual ironclad practicality. "He needs a vet," she muttered without being prompted. Caleb, standing near the sink, nodded. He was dressed in a faded green thermal shirt and jeans, his boots still unlaced. "I'll take him later today." June moved closer, kneeling slowly beside the basket, her knees cracking with age and resistance. Her hand hovered above Finley's fur, then gently made contact. Finley stirred slightly but didn't move away. Instead, he gave a soft sigh and pushed his muzzle further into the red blanket. "You gave him a name yet?" she asked. "Finley," Caleb said simply. "It just fit." June looked up at him. "He trusts you." Caleb hesitated. "I don't know why." June pressed her hand once more over the puppy's side and stood. "Because sometimes the broken find the broken. And fix each other." Outside, Ellie Whitmore stood hidden behind the weather-worn fence that divided the two houses. She wore a lavender hoodie 2 sizes too big and loose dark leggings. Her brown hair was pulled into a frizzy side ponytail, and her leg brace, dull metal with worn leather straps, clicked softly as she shifted her weight. In her hand was a tiny Ziploc bag filled with dog treats, bone-shaped, peanut butter scented. She had been watching since dawn. Ellie didn't know much about Caleb Rivers, except that he lived with his mother and rarely spoke more than a polite, "hello." He never smiled. And yet something about the way he had cradled that dog, his arms careful, his voice quiet, had stirred something in her. She stepped closer to the fence, knelt with difficulty, and slowly pushed one treat through a gap in the wooden slats. Then another. And another. She waited, her breath catching with anticipation, but no golden head appeared. Back inside, Finley had just begun to stir. His ears twitched, sensing something. Caleb noticed and followed his gaze toward the window. Then he saw the tiny hand on the other side of the fence, a child's hand, retreating quickly like a frightened bird. He opened the back door. Ellie froze. Her heart thumped hard in her chest as the door creaked open. Caleb stood in the doorway, surprised but not angry. "Hey," he said gently. Ellie looked up, cheeks already red from both cold and embarrassment. "Sorry. I wasn't trying to bother anyone. I just thought, maybe he'd like a treat." Caleb nodded once. "You know his name?" "No. I just saw him yesterday. Through the window." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "His name's Finley." Ellie smiled slightly. "That's a nice name. You can come say hi if you want." "He's still figuring things out." Ellie stood, a bit awkwardly, adjusting her balance. She walked with a subtle limp, her steps deliberate. Caleb noticed but said nothing. As she reached the porch, Finley was already at the open door, his nose sniffing curiously, tail tucked but not hidden. Ellie dropped to her knees, lowering her hand. "Hi, Finley," she whispered. Finley hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward slowly, sniffing her fingers. She giggled softly, the sound like chimes in the cold morning. "He likes you," Caleb said. Ellie looked up. "I like him too." June appeared at the doorway behind her son, holding a warm mug. She took in the scene, Ellie with the dog, Caleb with something like hope flickering behind his eyes. "Don't keep her out in the cold," June said, stepping back inside. Ellie blinked. "I probably should go. My mom, she works a lot." Caleb stepped aside. "You can visit. He seems to need friends." As Ellie turned to leave, she looked over her shoulder. "I could draw him." Would that be okay? Caleb smiled faintly, the kind of smile that had been gone for years. That would be more than okay. That afternoon, Ellie sat by her window with a sketchpad in her lap. She drew Finley curled into his blanket, then Finley beside a bowl, then Finley beside her. As she shaded his fur with careful lines, she imagined herself not as the girl with the brace, but as someone important in Finley's world, maybe even his knight. Her drawings were quiet, but they held more emotion than words ever could. Back at the Rivers house, Caleb stood near the fireplace, watching Finley chase a loose sock across the floor. June placed a bowl of kibble near the wall. We'll need to take him to the vet tomorrow. You can't keep him if he's not healthy. Caleb nodded. I'm not sure I'm keeping him. June raised an eyebrow. You gave him a name. He's sleeping in your laundry basket. And you let the neighbor kid come over to visit. Doesn't sound temporary. Caleb didn't answer. That night, Finley curled into his blanket as if it were stitched with safety. Caleb sat in the dark for a while, watching him breathe, thinking about how something so fragile could carry such weight in his chest. He whispered, "We'll figure this out." Finley didn't lift his head, but his tail gave a small thump against the floor, once, then still. Morning in Maple Hollow arrived in delicate whispers, a streak of soft light through the blinds, the rustling breath of trees shedding their last leaves, and the faint groan of wooden floors beneath bare feet. Inside the Rivers home, silence lay heavy but not lonely, wrapping the kitchen in the kind of stillness that invited memory to speak. Caleb stood by the counter, cradling a chipped mug of coffee. His flannel shirt, thrown on without much thought, hung loose over his frame. He hadn't shaved in 2 days, but the weariness in his eyes seemed lighter than usual. He stared across the room to the basket where Finley slept, curled in a perfect circle of golden fur and faded red fleece. The pup had begun to stir more often, lifting his head now and then to scan the room, as if memorizing it piece by piece. This morning, though, was different. It happened just as Caleb moved toward the back door. Finley's ears twitched first. Then his body stiffened. A low, uncertain sound escaped his throat. It was a single bark, thin, soft, but unmistakably his voice. Caleb froze. He turned slowly. "Hey there," he said quietly. Finley barked again, slightly louder this time, then stood up, stretching with a puppy's wobble and blinking as if surprised by his own sound. His tail gave a tentative wag. June entered the room, drying her hands on a dishcloth. "Was that?" she started, then smiled. "Well, I'll be." Finley turned toward her, lowered his head slightly in respect, then padded over and sat beside her feet. June reached down and gently scratched behind his ear. "I guess you've got something to say now." Caleb crouched beside them. "That's the first noise he's made since I found him." June nodded. "Maybe he's decided he's home." Finley leaned into her hand, and for a moment, the silence in the room was full of warmth instead of weight. Meanwhile, across the fence, Ellie was already sitting cross-legged on her porch, sketchpad balanced on her knees, bundled in a navy coat and rainbow scarf. Her cheeks were pink from the chill, but her eyes were bright with the anticipation of another glimpse. She'd drawn 5 new pictures since yesterday, each with more detail than the last. In one, Finley wore a knight's helmet. In another, he and Ellie stood back to back, like heroes in a fairy tale. She had titled that one, Sir Finley and Lady L. Her mother, Marla Whitmore, stepped out behind her. Marla was 39, tall, with wavy red-brown hair pulled into a low bun and deep lines around her mouth from years of balancing work, worry, and single motherhood. Dressed in scrubs, keys in one hand and a thermos in the other, she looked tired but present. "You're up early," she said. Ellie grinned. "I wanted to see him." Marla glanced toward the River's backyard. "The puppy?" Ellie nodded. Marla sighed. "Don't get attached." "I'm not," Ellie replied, though the pile of sketches beside her said otherwise. Marla leaned down, kissed the top of Ellie's head, and said, "Back porch lights on. If you need anything, call the office." Ellie nodded again, but her gaze had already returned to the slatted fence. Back inside, Caleb opened the door and let Finley sniff the porch. The pup took a few steps forward, then stopped. His head turned toward the fence, ears alert. Then, without hesitation, he trotted over and let out a single, eager bark. Ellie gasped. "Can I come over?" she called, peeking through the gap. Caleb looked up. "Sure. He seems to be waiting." Moments later, Ellie stepped into the yard, her boots leaving soft prints in the frost. She crouched near Finley, who wagged his tail wildly now, sniffing her hands and circling her legs. He barked, she whispered excitedly. "That means he feels safe now, right?" Caleb nodded. "I think it does." Finley pushed his snout into Ellie's coat pocket and fished out one of the treats she'd brought. She giggled. Smart and sneaky. June watched them from the window, her hands wrapped around a teacup. The laughter, the movement, the way Finley's ears perked whenever Ellie spoke, it was like a part of the house had come alive again. It had been too quiet for too long. Later that day, while Caleb made a vet appointment for the following morning, Ellie remained in the yard, her sketchpad resting on her lap as Finley curled against her side. She was telling him a story about a golden dog who rescued a girl with a magic compass when Caleb returned. "You're a good storyteller," he said, standing near the porch steps. Ellie looked up. "Thanks. I like making things up." "You ever write them down?" "I draw them instead. It's easier than words." "Maybe one day you'll write a book." "Only if Finley's in it," she said. The moment hung gently between them. Then Finley let out another bark, brighter this time. "He agrees," Caleb said. That evening, Finley lay in the living room near the fire, his head resting on Caleb's boot while Ellie read aloud from a dog training manual she'd borrowed from the library. "He's going to need stimulation," she said seriously, flipping the page. "And consistency. And protein-rich kibble." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You planning to train him?" "Someone has to." Caleb laughed, a quiet, surprised sound. June stepped in, drying her hands again. "If she's going to be this involved, maybe we should put her on payroll." Ellie grinned. "I'd accept treats as payment." As dusk settled outside and the fire crackled, Finley's eyes drooped. His tail wagged once, and then he was asleep, his body no longer curled so tightly, his breathing steady. Caleb watched him for a long moment, remembering the silence of that donation bin. Now, here, the room was filled with small sounds, pages turning, fire popping, the faint hum of a story continuing. And somewhere in the corner of that warmth, a once voiceless puppy had spoken. The sky above Maple Hollow had lost its autumn warmth. A cold front had rolled in, pushing clouds low and heavy across the horizon, casting everything in a dull silver light. The trees stood half-naked, their golden glory now carpeting the sidewalks in soft decay. Inside the river's home, a quiet Saturday morning unfolded like any other, but change, though invisible, was already moving toward them. Caleb stood by the window, sipping coffee, watching Finley chase a red tennis ball across the living room. The once frail golden retriever now bounded with purpose, his golden coat fuller from steady meals, his step stronger and more confident. The red blanket still rested in the laundry basket nearby, but Finley no longer slept curled into it, he simply laid beside it, like a memory he'd outgrown but wasn't ready to release. Across the room, Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, a purple pencil clutched in her hand as she added details to a new drawing. It showed Finley with a cape billowing behind him, leaping across rooftops to save a child. Her brow furrowed in concentration, she barely noticed when someone knocked at the front door. 3 firm knocks. June opened it. On the porch stood a man in his late 30s, tall with sun-worn skin, messy brown hair, and a tired baseball cap pulled low. He wore a zip-up hoodie with grease-stained jeans and sneakers that had seen better days. His eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp, and scanned the room behind June without waiting for permission. "Can I help you?" she asked, firm. "Yeah," the man said, not meeting her gaze. "I think you have my dog." Caleb appeared behind his mother, his tone even. "Excuse me." The man pointed past him, toward Finley, now standing by the couch, ears back, tail low. "That's Bullet," the man said. "I raised him from a pup. Went missing few weeks ago." June stiffened. "He was found in a donation bin, nearly starved. No collar. No chip. Are you saying you left him there?" The man's face twisted. "I didn't say that. Dogs run off. Maybe someone took him." Ellie, who had stopped drawing, slowly edged closer to Finley. The dog had not moved toward the man. In fact, he now backed up slightly, pressing against Ellie's leg. Caleb stepped fully into the doorway. "What's your name?" "Gavin," the man replied. "Gavin Cole. Look, I ain't here to start anything. I just want my dog back." "What vet registered him under your name?" Caleb asked. Gavin's jaw tensed. "Didn't get around to that yet." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "So, no records. No photos. No proof." "I don't need to prove anything," Gavin snapped. "He knows me." Caleb looked back. Finley hadn't moved. His tail didn't wag. His eyes, once dull, now bright with quiet thought, watched Gavin with something between wariness and pain. "I don't think he does," Caleb said. Gavin stepped forward, and that's when Finley growled, a low, warning rumble. Ellie stepped in front of him, small but solid. "You don't get to scare him," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He's not your dog anymore." Gavin blinked, surprised. "Kid, stay out of this." "No," she said. "He doesn't want to go with you. Look at him." Everyone turned. Finley stood straight now, his tail no longer tucked, his head high. He walked toward Caleb, slowly, deliberately, and sat at his feet. Gavin watched, silent. Then Caleb added, "Did you leave him in the bin? Wrapped in a red blanket?" "What?" Gavin asked, caught off guard. "That's how we found him. He was holding it. Shaking. Like someone dropped him like trash." There was a long pause. Gavin's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then he muttered, "I was out of options, all right. Didn't have food. Wasn't trying to hurt him." Caleb's voice hardened. "You did hurt him. I just want him back. You can't have him." Gavin's eyes flicked between Caleb, June, the girl, and the silent dog who hadn't moved from his new place of safety. Then he turned, muttering, "Screw this," and walked down the steps. Ellie reached for Finley's neck and stroked the soft fur behind his ears. "You did good," she whispered. "You were brave." Finley's head tilted slightly, then he leaned against her, the weight of his body pressing into her side. June closed the door quietly. The tension drained from the room, replaced by a stunned silence. Caleb looked down at Finley. "You chose," he said quietly. "You didn't even hesitate." That afternoon, Caleb took Finley for a long walk down the wooded trail behind the old maple grove. The sky had lightened, the sun peeking through gray clouds. Fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet. Finley sniffed at logs, chased a squirrel halfway up a tree, then circled back. When they reached the trail's end, Caleb sat on the bench beside the pond, and Finley climbed up and curled at his side. They sat together in stillness, like old friends. Back home, Ellie finished her newest drawing. She'd titled it, "When the Dog Said No." By the time the storm rolled into Maple Hollow, the town had already gone quiet. Rain began as a whisper against windowpanes, then quickly escalated into a steady roar that swallowed the last traces of twilight. The wind clawed at the eaves, and thunder cracked like the sky itself had been torn open. It was the kind of night where people drew curtains tight and turned up the volume on old radios to drown out the world. Inside the Rivers house, Caleb stood at the back window, arms crossed, watching the trees sway like dancers losing rhythm. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers. June had gone to bed early, and Ellie, after a long day of drawing, had returned home just before the first drops began to fall. But Finley was restless. The golden retriever paced near the door, his tail low but alert, nose pointed toward the wind. He'd been quiet all day, unusually so. Caleb had noticed. The pup's eyes tracked every shift in shadow, every low growl of thunder. He hadn't touched his dinner. Now, as the wind howled louder, Finley began to whine. Caleb kneeled beside him. "What is it, buddy?" he whispered. "You okay?" Finley pawed at the door. Caleb hesitated, then opened it a crack. The air was thick with rain and pine, the scent of soaked earth rushing in. Without hesitation, Finley bolted out into the night. "Finley!" Caleb threw on his coat and grabbed a flashlight. Rain slapped his face the moment he stepped outside. The beam of the light swung wildly across the yard. No golden fur. No barking. Nothing but darkness and water. "Finley!" he shouted again. Panic surged in his chest. He ran toward the back fence, sloshing through puddles, calling the dog's name over and over. Nothing. But Finley wasn't lost. He was following something. A scent. A memory. A hunch embedded deep in the instincts of dogs who once had nothing and now had something to protect. His legs churned through mud, ears pinned against the rain, until he reached an old part of town, just a few blocks past the grocery store, where the houses sagged and porches leaned like tired backs. He stopped at a narrow alley, nose twitching, then veered behind a boarded-up house to a covered back porch. A soft, almost invisible sound came from within the shadows. Whimpering. Under the porch, huddled beside a tipped-over plastic chair, was a boy, maybe 7 years old, his dark hair soaked, his hoodie clinging to him like a second skin. His knees were drawn to his chest, shivering. He didn't speak. Just stared, wide-eyed and silent. Finley barked, loud, urgent, panicked. 3 blocks away, Caleb heard it. He ran in the direction of the sound, following the echo of Finley's voice like a beacon through the downpour. He turned corners blindly, his boots splashing across flooded curbs, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Then he saw it, Finley, standing at the edge of a porch, barking and turning back toward the shadows. Caleb sprinted up the steps. "What is it?" "What?" Then he saw the boy. "Oh my God!" Caleb dropped to his knees, reaching carefully. The boy didn't flinch but looked close to collapse. Caleb wrapped him in his coat, lifted him gently, and nodded to Finley. "Let's go." At home, June had already pulled out blankets and turned up the heat. She didn't ask questions. She simply set out dry clothes and warmed a kettle. The boy didn't speak for a long while, just sat near the fire, wrapped in layers, Finley curled beside him like a living shield. His name was Jordan. He had wandered off from his foster home 2 days earlier and hadn't found his way back. It wasn't the first time. June made a call. Ellie's mother, Marla, who volunteered at the community center, came within minutes. She sat beside Jordan, speaking gently, her voice low and practiced. Eventually, he nodded when she asked if he was hungry. Progress. Ellie stood in the doorway, eyes wide. She had come with her mother and now knelt beside Finley, who wagged his tail but stayed pressed to Jordan's side. "He found him?" she asked Caleb. He nodded. "In the rain. On a porch. Barked until I got there." Ellie smiled. "He's not a knight anymore." Caleb frowned. "No. No," she said, voice filled with awe. "He's a guardian. That night, as the rain softened and the wind settled, Finley lay beside the fire, Jordan's fingers tangled in his fur. Caleb sat quietly nearby, listening to the slow, steady breaths of both child and dog. Somewhere in the night, something had shifted. This house, once filled with shadows, was now holding light again. In her own house next door, Ellie drew a new picture. She called it, The Porch and the Storm. Morning dawned without ceremony. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles on the roads, broken twigs across porches, and the clean smell of rain-washed air. Inside the river's home, the atmosphere was different, not quieter, but fuller, as if the house had finally exhaled. Caleb stood by the fireplace, looking at Finley. The dog had slept peacefully all night, not once curling into the red blanket. It lay untouched in the basket. June poured coffee, watching her son from across the kitchen. "He's not just visiting anymore, is he?" Caleb smiled, slow and sure. "No. He's staying." Ellie arrived later that morning with a drawing in hand, Finley sitting beside a bed labeled, Ryan's, crossed out and rewritten as, mine. "My mom said maybe we could get a dog too," Ellie said hopefully. "But only if I can prove I'm responsible." "You've already done that," Caleb replied. He glanced toward Finley, who padded over and sat at Ellie's feet. That evening, Caleb brought out a small wooden frame and slipped inside a photo, a picture of Finley, Ellie, and himself on the back porch. He set it beside an older one, of a woman with warm eyes and wind-blown hair. "I think she'd have liked you," he whispered to Finley. Outside, the porch light clicked on. A new habit. Finley stepped onto the porch that night alone and curled beside the swing. He watched the street, ears alert, not out of fear but out of presence. The house behind him was no longer a stop along the way. It was his. When Ellie asked that night if Finley could come sleep in her bed, just once, Caleb hesitated, but June said, "Let him choose." Finley followed her upstairs. In the morning, Caleb found them curled together, Ellie sleeping soundly, Finley snoring softly, no blanket in sight. He no longer needed the red fleece to feel safe. He had something better now. He was no longer the puppy in the donation bin. He was Finley. He was family. Some souls arrive in our lives not with grand entrances, but wrapped in silence and trembling. Finley wasn't just a puppy left behind, he was a question life asked quietly: can you still open your heart when it's bruised? Can you still trust after being dropped? He didn't come with papers, a name, or a plan. He came with a red blanket, a scared heartbeat, and a need for someone to stay. And in choosing him, they didn't just rescue a dog, they rescued parts of themselves. Because family isn't who you're given. It's who stays when the storm hits. It's the little girl who waits by the fence. The man who bends down instead of walking away. And the dog who, once voiceless, chooses to speak, with loyalty. So if you've ever wondered whether second chances matter, just ask Finley. And if you believe every life deserves one, let us know in the comments below. Type Amen if you've ever chosen love, even when it was easier to look away.